Okay. All right. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I am Dr. Dana Collins. I'm the president of New York Association of Black Psychologists. We are so happy that you are joining us tonight for a continuation of, or part 2 of the Harambe Initiative's Empowering the Black Mind, a conversation on how we navigate white fragility. So some of you were with us a couple of weeks ago when we began this conversation, and there were many things that people felt that they wanted to continue talking about and explore a little more deeply. So we are holding we're continuing our conversation tonight. Before I turn it over to our facilitators, Dr. Tanya White-Davis and Francesca Maxime, I just want to say a few words about us, about New York Association of Black Psychologists. So we are a chapter of ABPSI, or Association of Black Psychologists, which is a national association, and we see our mission as and destiny as the liberation of the African mind, empowerment of the African character, and enlivenment and illumination of the African spirit. So tonight's conversation will focus particularly on the empowerment and liberation of our minds. So we typically begin our events with a cultural grounding exercise. And I think that's it's always important, but particularly for this conversation, which can be very challenging and will call on us to, expend some of our mental and psychological energy. We really want to make sure that we feel grounded and connected. So we're going to just call on the ancestors to be with us, to give us strength, help us to be centered, and help to guide us, because our ancestors come with much wisdom, and we just want them to be with us tonight. So because we have a fairly large group, I'm just going to ask us to, well, let's start off by just taking a few deep healing breaths to just calm and center ourselves. And as you begin to just settle, call to mind the names of ancestors and who you want to be with you, to be with us tonight. And it might be personal ancestors, and it might be collectivistic ancestors. But just take a few moments to call on them. Okay, and we're just going to take a couple more moments. Ashe, Ashe. All right, so I am going to go ahead and turn it over to our facilitator. So we have past president, Dr. Tanya White-Davis, who facilitated the wonderful conversation a couple of weeks ago. She is returning. And then we are also joined by licensed somatic psychotherapist and anti-racism educator, Francesca Maxime, who will be co-facilitating. So without further ado, I will hand it over. Thank you both so much for providing guidance tonight.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Dana.
Good evening, everyone. I guess, we'll start off with a little bit of a review from last week, just to kind of get everybody a little bit on the same page, and then, you know, get a little bit of a background information. And then hopefully we're just going to have a conversation. We really want to encourage everyone to, when you have a thought, a question, a comment, to utilize the chat, but also feel free to unmute yourself and or raise your hand using the raise your hand feature. And you know, let's just engage in conversation with each other. So to do that, of course, we want to you know, try to keep a respectful room of opinions and thoughts that people have, knowing that, you know, we come to this space with different thoughts, different ideas. And so we want to be in dialogue with each other. And if you find yourself as a person who feels very comfortable in spaces, lending your voice, to also maybe think about taking the step back to listen to voices as well. And if you feel as though you're one who tends to listen mostly, maybe thinking about looking at that growing edge and seeing how you might want to raise your voice in this space as well. So we encourage you to think in both ways. And also we want to acknowledge that this is a space that has many people from many different areas, different backgrounds. But we do also want to, in this conversation, particularly center Black, Indigenous, and people of color voices as a way of really engaging this conversation from that lens. So just wanted to kind of make sure that we had that kind of conversation at the very beginning so we can all be on the same page with that. A couple weeks ago, we had a really interesting conversation, and it really just kind of got started when we had to end. So I just want to acknowledge that, you know, we had a very interesting comments towards the end around processes that happen within this space and ways in which you know, white fragility can show up, ways in which intersectionality plays a part in what we are experiencing and how we might engage with each other. So we're going to be mindful of that today and really try to have conversations that address that as well. And so, you know, unfortunately, we weren't able to truly dive into it last time, so hopefully we will be able to do that today as well.
Tanya, before we begin,
Yes.
I just wanted to acknowledge the presence of our national ABSI president, who has joined our session today, Dr. Ethiopia.
Dr. Ethiopia Jackson. And Dr. Jackson,
thank you.
Yes, please don't feel pressured to, we hope that you won't feel put on the spot, but we are very honored to have you join. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Just greetings, family. Thank you for acknowledging me, but I really am here to have my mind, body, and spirit fed and to be with family. So I just want to thank you for having the space. And so I will stay and take it all in.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Okay, so just to kind of review very quickly some of what we had talked about before. But before I do that, Francesca, do you have any comments you'd like to say at the beginning here?
Thank you, Tanya. Just a warm hello to everyone, and really a pleasure to be included in co-facilitating this with you and just sort of continuing the conversation from last time, and just sort of echoing what you said before, which is just that although this is potentially, you know, this is, you know, like you said, people of all different ethnicities, backgrounds and whatnot on the call, that we're really centering Black voices and voices of color. And so again, like you just said, you know, if there is something that comes up, just notice what it's like perhaps in your body. Notice what it's like to actually sort of sense what it's like to have to withhold or to have to sort of feel as though maybe you're not saying what is on your mind, and just notice what happens. And maybe if we can turn a friendly attention or a curiosity to that urge or to whatever our experience is there, and just sort of kind of get curious about, so this is what it feels like in the body to kind of want to lean in, but sort of notice that I'm actually being intentional about being able to be present and being fully present, but also enabling there to be more space for more voices. So I would just maybe say that. And then again, like we were saying before, you just mentioned last time, we sort of had some charge there at the end of the conversation from a couple of weeks ago. And, when we talk about, I work a lot, somatically with trauma, sometimes there's pieces there that sort of get stuck in the body. And so maybe the invitation there is to just say, if there is anything else that's, lingering there or that's stuck there, trauma is sort of too much, too fast, too soon. Of course, there's different kinds of trauma and even a micro trauma. And I'm not saying there was in this case by any means at all. We may be able to just continue and have this conversation start fresh. But however, if there was anything there, that it's okay to just surface that and to just sort of notice that. And again, get curious. What was it like in the body to not be able to sort of complete that, right? Because trauma is about the desire for completion and the reception, trauma resolution of that. And so if there are any tendrils there that need to be attended to just be mindful of that and what, your body might be speaking about that. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to pause for a moment, maybe to allow anyone to voice anything from last week. Or keep saying last week, it's 2 weeks ago.
Well, I'm sorry. Yeah, it is 2 weeks ago. You're right.
2 weeks ago.
Yeah, right.
That they might want to voice from last time.
And just naming, as you said, there are the intersectional pieces that came up around not only race and, dynamics, but also, male-female dynamics in terms of patriarchy, and also the welcoming of the international community and how different folks within different aspects of different cultures and different, continents and whatnot are processing things. And so, again, just sort of naming it, touching it lightly, and if it's, dissolved, I think that's fine.
Right. So with that, I'm going to just go ahead and review a little bit. What do we mean by white fragility? Get that definition in the room so we are working in the same way. And talk a little bit about some of what we discussed last time. Very briefly, so I'm going to share the screen and we'll go back and forth between screen share and this lovely gallery view. So in our last meeting, we did review this article written by Chad Sanders that was in the New York Times on June 5th of this year, talking about his experience as a writer trying to produce a book for people of color, by people of color, to be able to talk about the Black mind. And his work got a little sidetracked, pushed back by his agent that wanted to make space for essentially some of the white voices and pain and guilt that was happening in his space. And that brought up a lot for him as well. So he writes very well around his experience with essentially white fragility that turned up in his space. And so I would recommend definitely reading that article. And so that really led us to this conversation about white fragility, trying to kind of figure out, like, how does it manifest? How does it show up in our spaces? And what is the impact specifically for people of color as we interface with this very specific phenomenon? So Robin DiAngelo talks about white fragility in her book, White Fragility, Why It's Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, and really goes in depth in what that concept is. But as far as a definition, just kind of putting it out there for right now, that white fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stressor becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moods. These moods include outward displays of emotions, such as fear and guilt, and behaviors of such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. And this can be something that is so small and implicit that we don't even realize sometimes that it might be happening at the moment, as well as it can be very explicit and very overt. So, and what that brings up for us as people of color, if you identify as a Black or an Indigenous or person of color, that can bring up so much. And knowing how to navigate that could be very different in different spaces. And that's kind of what we want to touch on today and talk about. So we have a way of thinking about our experience, naming it, and just having a conversation on how do we navigate that? What do we do? And how does it impact our life? We talked a little bit about the idea of emotional equity and how it often we're not fully able to express what that impact might be. What is it that we might feel as BIPOC? And then that's what I'm going to use as a term right now. What that actually means. We may not fully be able to express that in all spaces, and that in and of itself being an oppressive force. So how do we navigate that as an issue as well? So I'm going to open it up right now just for people to kind of take that in and see if you have a thought about that, if there's anything that might bring up for you.
May I just also emphasize what the definition of the emotional equity is, just for anyone who may not be entirely familiar, because I think it just sort of gets to the heart of what
Yes.
we're trying to do, allowing people to empathize or emotionally connect to a new idea of way of doing things. Emotional equity, a combination of our deep care and investment in the success of a campaign, the creative expertise to ensure that success and equity. I mean, that's just sort of a textbook definition, but it's really the ability to show up and care and empathize and be in the space. But Tanya, you can go on more about that, but and how that dynamic plays out in terms of white fragility and having to navigate spaces, if it's there or not.
Right, and definitely being able to show up in a space, and I think the being able part is that equity piece. Equity meaning that all people would be able to show up and have that same level of showing empathy and care and being able to be their full emotional selves and full range of emotion, human emotion, in all spaces. And that's not necessarily the case. So that's where that equity piece comes in. Right. So thank you.
Yeah.
So I guess we'll just open it up. Does that bring up any thoughts for people? How does that relate to any of your experience with white fragility, as well as the idea of showing up emotionally in all spaces? And feel free to unmute yourself at this point if you have a thought.
And maybe just the equity piece, as you were saying about power, do I have the power to be my authentic self in this space fully? Or is there going to be blowback or repercussions? And if so, then how do I have to navigate that? And if so, what does that mean in terms of perhaps the way that I feel, the way I'm able to even operate, do my job, perform my role, what kinds of ways in which the lack of emotional equity in certain spaces due to white fragility and dynamics around power and equity there influence my capacity to really own the space and be fully alive, as you said before in the part one, authentic, you know, at all times. And that's sort of that, you know, traumatic piece of safety. I think it's equity piece, but it's also a safety piece. And if there's more safety, then it opens up the opportunity for there to be more emotional equity. And I think that's kind of the fundamental piece. Otherwise, the nervous system will continue to have to navigate and not feel as though it's able to really fully show up safely.
If I can add something here, so I missed last session, so I'm not sure if this was discussed, but in my experience, I've found that there are kind of, you could look at three kind of types of white fragility or how it manifests. At least in my experience, I've noticed like an avoidant type, and then there's also kind of an aggressive type, and then there's also a very, very guilty type. And I think that, you know, depending on which strain of white fragility you encounter, it brings a different element to the space, of course, and then your reaction to it, what it brings out from you is different. At least for me personally, you know, in my experience at grad school, I definitely experienced all three of those kinds of strains of white fragility and have to navigate them differently. So I just wanted to bring that to the conversation.
Thank you. That's such a great point, because, you know, there's different types, different ways in which it manifests. And I think, you know, that really does pull upon different ways of responding to it. And, you know, I guess I'm very curious as to some of the examples. I don't want to put you on the spot, Rod, but I'm very curious as to like some of the ways in which that has come up, especially the avoidant type.
Well, I think the avoidant type might be the most common one. You know, just this general discomfort, not having much to say in certain conversations and trying to leave the space, and that kind of thing. But to me, the one that concerns me the most is the guilty type, because those are usually friends or people who want to be allies, and that's, to me, that's the one that you really find yourself having to navigate and engage with, right? You can ignore the others or deal with them in another way, but I think the guilty type, the one that comes from allies and friends, is the one that I think gives me the most that I have to think about how to navigate the most. And so I have lots of white friends, and the majority of them are you know, always thinking about how they can make up or what they can do to contribute, and it becomes a burden for them, and then by extension it becomes burdensome for you to always have to, like, you know, make space for their trying to do something. So yeah, I'm not sure if I can give any more specific an example, but I encounter that a lot with just friends. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that you actually hit the nail on the head when it comes to the guilty type. That was really articulated in the article as well. How challenging it is to navigate the allies and friends that you may have that identify as white, and what that means to navigate both the relationship and the fragility that you're experiencing. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And also thinking about the avoidant type as well, how that comes up in conversations. There's been experiences where you might be trying to engage in a conversation about race, about racism, about white supremacy and white supremacy culture, and the conversation might turn very quickly to other areas of identity. And that too might be a way of avoiding that conversation and moving away from a stressor.
And you know what I'm thinking, Rod, as you're speaking, and Dana knows this because she's going to be enrolled in the mindfulness training also. As a mindfulness teacher, those three core principles are sort of, you know, craving, wanting too much, avoiding, being aversive, and sort of deluded, or otherwise, you know, sort of upside down. These are old sort of, you know, ways of like the way people sort of have their default. And so it's no surprise that it comes out here, but how it manifests, of course, in terms of your life, in terms of sucking away the space and energy for you to live your life because someone is feeling, you know, guilty and then sort of trying to maybe overdo or something. You know, how to then create or have the conversation where you can still protect your energy, as my friend Mama Rod says. You know, how do you create a limit or a boundary around how much of that so that you can still feel like you have a container and space to be your authentic self there.
I want to just share a little bit. I've been struggling with how to articulate this in my mind, but I feel conflicted oftentimes, where there's a part of me that I think many other people of African descent also experience, this idea of sort of just the Black fatigue and what it means to even have to talk about on a conceptual level how white individuals are managing their anti-racism, you know, struggles, or the unrest, or these kinds of conversations when there's such a dearth of like emotional energy, where I feel like I want to be very protective of the limited energy that I have. And so sometimes even conversations like this, to me, feel off target. It feels as if I am really needing to create a space where there is a way of uplifting and engaging in a healing process, so we could fortify ourselves before we get to the point of having to engage in these kinds of explanations or processes of negotiating the different strains of the white fragility. That, you know, that's sort of like, I'm thinking of like, you know, hierarchy of needs, you know, and like when I'm dealing with safety, I'm dealing with, you know, getting through, you know, the racial trauma of the day. I don't even have that energy to devote to tending to white fragility. But I know there's also a need for allyship. I know that there's a need for conversations that allow for space for different voices. And so I go back and forth constantly within myself around how much I honestly have the patience and the emotional energy to give that. So I just wanted to speak to that. I was feeling that a little bit after our last conversation. And, you know, I didn't know what was really bothering me. And I realized that it was that, you know, this time could have been spent doing something that was, you know, liberatory, that was around our, you know, emotional emancipation, that was self-care, you know. And when do we take inventory, you know, of our needs and be clear about the first order of business? So I just wanted to share that, that I'm always in two spaces.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, Dr. Codrington, because that, I think, is the big impetus for me for this kind of conversation. It's that continued emotional toll. You know, when I had to deal with my own level of emotional fatigue, around the white fragility I was experiencing in my space, in my life, with people around me, that's exactly what came up for me. And that's why I was really interested in trying to have, this conversation with everyone, because it's important to kind of think about, like, how is that in and of itself, white fragility becomes another level of injury, especially in times like this where we're already emotionally told, if you will, from everything that's happened, from physical exhaustion, from dealing with the multiple ways in which we've experienced levels of trauma, in addition to COVID and just all of it. And then have to have some level of reserve in different spaces, depending on where you are in work or in personal life, to have to engage and navigate white fragility. It almost feels like another injury, another level of injury. So the point being, how do we then find different ways of not having to do that, of not having to necessarily expend the energy, but find ways of actually moving towards liberation, moving towards building that reserve, as you mentioned. So I would love to hear people's thoughts on how that's been for them to try to build that reserve.
Hi, this is Marla. I don't have thoughts on how to build the reserve, just adding to the question and kind of the dimension of, I don't know if I would say guilty, but it's like to the point of, should I use this time to build allyship? So it's like, so my white friends are at various points in their growth and understanding, right? And so it's like, should the time be used to build allyship? I'm disappointed when they're not bringing it up, but then I don't want to be the one to always have to bring up, race and racism and what that might look like. Just what's healthy for me, what the bigger movement, how are people going to know, I need help with the intersectionalities that I struggle with to learn and grow. And I need people to teach me. So, and trying to do the work on my own, podcasts and speech, just try to make myself more aware and learn and not burden others. And yet I don't know what I don't know. So I kind of throw that out at the group to say yes. And this is where I am today on the 25th of July, 2020.
Yeah.
And I'm glad I'm not alone. So, praise God for that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think one of the things that just stuck out to me is what you were talking about with also building allyship is, I guess I would pose that as a question too to the group. Is that also part of building the reserve? Being able to build allyship by saying, here's what you can do so that it leaves space for you to engage in your own level of rejuvenation. I pose that to the group.
And then there's one other complexity to add to it. So one of my friends, I've been sending different things to listen to and blah, blah, blah. So she sent me something to listen to and kind of brought up the issue of anti-Semitism. And so is that her whiteness kind of centering herself, or is that her reality, her lived experience, in which case, I'm just not sure what to do. Like, okay, so are we competing now for, who's more oppressed? Like, I don't really know what to do with that. So I just kind of left it alone for now. I listened to it and just left it alone.
May I? Yeah, what comes for me there is, again, from the mindfulness perspective of, is like, what's the deepest intention behind why what is the deepest intention about why she would be bringing that up at that juncture from her perspective, right? What part of her is surfacing that right now? Yeah, I used to call it the trauma Olympics. She calls it the impression Olympics. And sort of maybe to reflect back, I'm curious about, certainly, we're aware of that. And I'm curious about what it is within you that is having you surface that with me right now as we're having this conversation, and maybe sort of come back and forth with this, because I think that it's very easy to get in that, ping pong match about it. And it's always sort of, in my experience, when having to deal with it, the both and that can be helpful. That is true. And there's a unique anti-Black racism here that has systems of oppression that continue in this culture now, that because of the lighter white skin racial advantage, despite the anti-religious situation, do affect people like me when I walk into a store in a way that they probably don't affect you, right? And that it's just, but how much of that do you want to do at any given day is where's your energy, right?
And then Tanya Hucks Bradshaw, you mentioned that this experience is something that you've often had when engaging with some colleagues as well. So thank you for sharing that.
Yes, I wanted to add, because it seems like several of us deal with that or confront that, and we wonder what it's about, because on the one hand, we don't want to be dismissive, but on the other hand, we don't want to be dismissed ourselves. And that's kind of where my mind goes a lot of the time when I'm talking about my experience or the experience of Black people, and this, what about these people or my people comes up. It just feels like more sort of, the word I keep coming up with is dismissiveness, which is, another form, another form of racism. Like, you're not really worth talking about. Let's talk about me. Let's center me. And, so it's really difficult for me to know, is that really what's happening, or is it something else? Because I realize that it can be more, there are multiple options, or not options, but multiple possibilities. But I think because of my experience of not being seen or being minimized, that's sort of where my mind goes, that, oh, this doesn't feel worth talking about to you. And, I think it also relates, obviously relates very much to the not being able to tolerate my experience or my pain. So, just a very typical manifestation of white fragility. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And that is a very typical manifestation of white fragility. Needing to even show some level of solidarity or understanding in some ways by putting forth your experience does in some way lend to that dehumanization process, that I'm a bit more human than you at this moment, and my needs take precedent. So it is a big part of that white fragility that we have to navigate as well, that we're put up against. And then going back to Jamila's point, when you don't have emotional reserves and you need to be able to center yourself, why is that not okay? Why is that not acknowledged or seen as valid. I think this, for me, that also speaks to what a gentleman mentioned in our last segment in regards to the systemic nature of racism, the systemic nature of white supremacy culture, and how there's a socialization process throughout our time here, throughout history in this country, that Black needs are not necessarily made valid. It's the anti-Blackness that you're just talking about.
Right. And it's a very specific, way. And as you were talking, Dana, again, how much energy does one have, right? Like how much energy does one want to expend? But what came up for me is, again, from a trauma perspective, this idea of like leaning in and also like protecting, right? So like we're connecting and protecting at the same time. And this question of allyship and sort of leveraging where having a co-accomplice or, a co-conspirator, and, where is that actually like worth my time and effort and when is it not? I found helpful the nonviolent communications piece of, when I hear you speak of your experience, when I am telling you of the pain within my experience around this issue, I feel disappointed and sad and, frustrated or whatever it is that's coming up for you. I need to feel like our allyship, our friendship is available to me to be able to have a full range of my feelings so that I feel safe in our relationship. I value our relationship and our connection and your support and connection with me and my ability to be there for you also. Would you be willing to let me have my time here to just express myself in a way and know and trust and have faith that in our friendship and in our growing connection, that will also be shared with you. That when we're sort of coming at it from this non-violently communicative way, which again, to Jamila's point, if you have the energy to go through that process of the NVC, can be helpful in terms of calling in if you are trying to, sort of maybe fortify that allyship piece.
And I just want to acknowledge Yvonne, and I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, Yvonne Desant, who mentioned cultural competency. Does cultural competency lower that fragility when it comes to race? I guess that is a very interesting and important question, especially when we think about systemic nature of racism. And I have a thought about that, but I don't want to take too much space. I'm going to pose that to the group, see if anyone has thoughts about that.
I would say no. It can lessen it. However, because of how deep it's embedded, it always manifests at some point. That's just my view.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, darling. Yes, I think it's challenging because systemic racism, the nature of racism being systemic, there's a significant level of socialization that's happened. We just talking about this. Socialization has happened in this country globally when it comes to how people think about race. And let's just take one system, one of the many systems that we have in this country, education. When it comes to how people are educated, are we educated in this country to acknowledge and see validity in Black lives? There are marches now that are actually saying Black Lives Matter, and people that are still saying that that's not accurate. How does that happen? How is that developed, that level of invalidity? So I'm not sure what the answer to that question is, but that's kind of what the socialization process really is, what that brings up for me when I hear that question. And I think there are lots of different ways in which systemically things are reinforced in this country, education system being one of them. So what would it mean to then dismantle that level of education, a type of education, to then speak to the validity of Black lives and what that means as far as the socialization process, thus lowering white fragility. I don't, that's a thought that I'm having from this question. So thank you so much, Yvonne, for bringing that up. I don't know if anyone else has other thoughts or comments on that.
Mm. Yes, the media. I'm a former journalist, and I'm like, yes, I definitely echo that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In all kinds of ways. You know, the pictures that we choose to be on TV, the ones that we don't,
Mm-hmm.
you know, when do we use a mugshot? I was a news anchor and a reporter. When do we use a mugshot? When do we not? You know, who gets to decide, you know, if we do or not? It is very insidious in that way.
And how do we fight against it? How do we defy the lie? How do we heal that liberation piece? You know, how do I grow up in a smoky room and not smell of smoke? I mean, that's the fight. That's almost the weariness, because it's not just external. It's not just, you know, whatever the opposite of white fragility is. It's like, you know, how can I tell? You know, am I protecting white people? Am I trying to take care of them? Am I not taking care of myself? You know, what are my internalized oppression? What does that look like? And how to fight against it.
Thank you. I'm so glad you brought up, you know, defying the lie. I think that's very important and inherent in that socialization process. And also in thinking about how are we defying the lie of white superiority when we think about the socialization in this country as well. So thank you. Very important.
And Nicole Hannah-Jones just got blowback for the 1619 Project after winning the Pulitzer a year later from Tom Cotton because, you know, they don't want it taught in schools the way that it has been. I mean, using federal funds to do that. So the whole systemic nature of this in terms of the legislature, I mean, the gains made, I think some of the exhausting pieces, the gains made are easily, you know, thrown a wrench.
Yeah.
I just wanted to comment that I'm really struck lately about even our use of the words anti-Black so freely and white supremacy so freely now, when we weren't using these words at all, and sort of even taking it in a way, to me, it even neutralizes them to sort of be these throwaway expressions almost, that now where everyone is anti-Black or, you know, but what does that really mean? Like, you know, in my workplace, I work in a center, a counseling center, and there's this real impetus to do all of this work around anti-Blackness, but even unpacking that for people. I'm the only Black staff member, and having to say, well, let's take a beat and even decide if we're in agreement about what that even means. You know, that means something totally different to me perhaps than it means to you. And do you have the capacity to talk about that with students and with, you know, in a real way that's not going to be harmful or damaging, because you really don't know how. So, and even that, I'm a little regretful even, because now I have to engage in those conversations in a way that maybe I didn't anticipate. Really, it's the work that has to be done. But anyway, even even that has struck me, to be honest, and I don't really know how I feel. I'm unsettled by it. I just wanted to share that.
Thank you for sharing that. And definitely, especially if you're one of the few BIPOC people in your space, having to even be put in the position of teaching in that moment, if you will, can be, yes, another emotional burden. Thank you for sharing that. There have been a few comments as well in the chat. Just want to acknowledge. Yvonne Dosan again mentioned, when we are aware of any one culture, we tend to stereotype often too, while cultures do not overlap everybody of the same group, since individualities differ from mainstream culture. And Tanya Hucks Bradshaw mentioned, yes, I think perhaps folks have been socialized since forever that BIPOC will take care of them, which I think speaks to your point that you just mentioned about having to take care of the people in your space and teach the people in your space. And we've got, and Joselita Mercado mentioned, and we have gotten socialized to do it too. It's hard to decipher the why, if it's within my nature to respond the way I do, or was it imposed? Very important question. And Dr. Cotton just mentioned, thank you for that, Rhea. That feels like performative white allyship to me. And I don't think we have a responsibility to cater to that. I think that performative nature of allyship that we kind of talked about last segment as well really does come out, especially in times when you see level of unrest in society, and that white fragility comes out in that way as well as performative acts. All right. So one of the things that have been brought up in this conversation is thinking about how do we move towards liberation of having to care for or take care of others. How do we get to that place where we can be able to have a restorative moment for ourselves, to be able to engage in a liberation for BIPOC people. And so Francesca sent me a link that helped me to kind of think through this thought, and this video clip of Toni Morrison talking about why she focuses on Black people in her book, and doesn't privilege white people in her book. And I just wanted to share that with you all. If I can get it up, hold on a moment. Bear with me.
As a journalist.
Can you write about Black people?
That's right. Can I say that? What kind of question is that to put to Ed Doctorow, who has done it, by the way?
Sure.
But I mean, if I can say, when are you going to write about Black people to a white writer, if that's a legitimate question to a white writer, then it is a legitimate question to me. I just don't think it is. You know, so the glove has to be pulled inside out. If it's in other words, it's not a literary question. It has nothing to do with the literary imagination. It's a sociological question that should not be put to me. I couldn't ask that of any writer who was, I wouldn't ask it of a Black writer when you're going to write about white people. Now, maybe I'm wrong. You can tell me now or later if I've blown it up all out of proportion. I don't think so. I just don't know what the question means except what I think it means. You think it may just be a little question, a little curious, small. Incidental question. Maybe I'm responding because I have had reviews in the past that have accused me of not writing about white people. I remember a review of Sula in which the reviewer said, this is all well and good, but one day she, meaning me, will have to face up to the real responsibilities and get mature and write about the real confrontation for black people, which is white people. As though our lives have no meaning and no depth without the white gaze. And I've spent my entire writing life trying to make sure that the white gaze was not the dominant one in any of my books. And the people who helped me most arrive at that kind of language were African writers. Chinua Achebe, Bessie Head. Those writers who could assume the centrality of their race.
Question, can you imagine?
So finding that clip, as Toni Morrison was speaking specifically about that piece, she further mentions how that was to engage in conversations with those African writers who could assume the centrality of their race. That was liberating. Being able to then write and center Black people in her writing was liberating. So that kind of spoke to me, especially in thinking about this idea of emotional equity and what does it mean to be able to speak to what is needed for you as a Black person in this country. So I don't know if anyone has thoughts about that clip, any reactions. Please feel free to unmute yourselves.
Hi, would you be open to sharing the question again?
Really no just question. At this point, it's not really a question, just more, does anybody have any comments, any thoughts about that clip? Did it bring up anything for anyone?
Yeah, so it brought up a lot for me. Hi, everyone. My name is Ilan Awalam, and I'm training as a somatic experiencing practitioner, which is how I found out about this because of Francesca's work. And so for me, my parents are from Eritrea in Northeast Africa, but I was raised in the United States. And so I actually was having a reaction as I pondered the fact that I didn't have that lived quote unquote African experience, right? With like the centrality of people of my heritage, you know? And so I'm actually having a reaction of like, oh, grieving again, you know, that I did not have that experience, right? And that in many ways, definitely not in all ways, but in many ways, my experiences are closer to that of people who are descendants of enslaved Africans versus, you know, people who had a more continental African experience.
Mm.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ellen, for sharing. And again, the cost of whiteness, right? The cost of whiteness. I mean, I think it was Rhea earlier who was speaking about, you know, sort of how much are we naming these terms? Are they becoming throwaway terms? Anti-Blackness, white supremacy, white body supremacy. But for the purposes of this conversation, I do think that, not in this setting as much, but with white people, I often really do name whiteness because the cost of whiteness, the cost of that assimilation is so great and so separating. So, you know, it takes away the sense of collective belonging that Tanya was using the word collectivist earlier, and clearly that that is not the Western philosophy.
There's a comment. I think there's a comment I want to speak to, but just to kind of piggyback on what you were just mentioning, Francesca, I think it's also what is brought up when we are faced with these legacies of white supremacy in this culture. When we think about the white fragility that we're faced with, it's that, again, that mourning of not only the fact that it impacts our white counterparts, but also the fact that we're continuously not able to fully come into spaces because of that legacy. So there is a level of mourning around not being able to have that centrality. And yet, with that clip also reminding me the ways in which, even on a daily basis and in different ways, how could we engage in that centrality and have a bit more of that liberation occurring? So I don't know if there's ways in which that is brought up for people, and ways in which they try to engage in that centrality, and both as individuals, and how do we do that as a collective as well, going back. There's a comment also in the chat. Dr. Muhammad Al-Rahman asks, is that issue of education grounded in the addressing or embracing the views that systemic racism, white supremacy has been deliberate in embracing an axiological and epistemological worldview that sees no value or human beingness of Black peoples and Black bodies? So again, thank you. So again, speaking to that legacy of white supremacy culture and how deliberate that might be.
So Tanya, this is Ethiopian, and please know as I join this conversation as a family member, no more, no less. And I've been reflecting on the comments that Jamila made earlier in terms of the exhaustion, and then listening to our dear Elder Morrison. And this is what's emerged for me in this moment. I'm curious what it brings up for the listeners as well. I'm still a bit curious about, we appear to spend a lot of time, quote, naming the problem. And which is important, of course. However, I'm also wondering, are we spending enough time on naming who we are in our solutions as a people? Even like the question of Toni Morrison and the way she was responding to that, it's like, why is it that talking about us somehow calls a question in for someone? It's a whole dilemma around the Black Lives Matter. Again, I hope I'm not like losing trains of thought here, but it's like to say Black Lives Matter and someone has to cross out and say all, or it's like every time we're in a conversation about our Blackness, somehow someone asks us about somebody else. And yet and I could be missing this, but I have yet to see that happen when our First Nations, our brothers and sisters, are talking about their experience. No one is saying, what about Black folks? or not even that. They're not even saying, what about white folks? It's just like, we're talking just about this group, and everyone's okay with that and comfortable with it. Now, of course, sometimes that comes at a risk of people co-opting someone's experience, which has happened with our First Nations in terms of as they opened up the space and talked more about their healing rituals and particularly the use of the sweat lodge. Next thing we know, someone now has it as part of their retreat weekend and charging people several $1,000s. So there is that risk. But I think I want to close back with this is back where I started, which is being a bit perplexed about, are we in a healthy balance, or are we somehow spending most of our time on naming the problem versus illuminating our brilliance? I hope that makes sense for listeners. Maybe it's just late for me.
Thank you so much. That does make perfect sense. And I think hoping that that's kind of where we go with this question, especially in thinking about, how are we moving? How can we move towards liberation, towards centralizing, getting that sense of humanity back? And not necessarily focusing on what white people need to do, and we do need to have some level of that, but we, focusing it on what we are doing, what we can do, what are ways in which we are focusing on centralizing ourselves and focusing on having that be the part of the conversation. So I thank you for your comment, because it's very needed in this space. So I'm hoping everyone can kind of chime in and talk about what that means here. How can we bring that in?
I want to add something onto that, but I want to start by acknowledging Dr. Codrington's comment. Centralizing our race, for me, means asking, what would our African ancestors do in this moment? How would they be spending their time? And I think that's such an excellent question. And it sort of reminds me why when we come together for our events, we like to call on the ancestors, because they had to respond to and navigate through so much, and having their energy with us can be very, very empowering. And I think that speaks more generally to the importance of taking a culturally grounded or African centered perspective. And, to the point of, if we know who we are, I think, are less impacted by the negative messages we get about ourselves, because we already know, and we know that it's not right, that it comes from a place of a lot of just negative places. And I don't mean to get too far off topic, but I am thinking about my doctoral dissertation, which looked at parental ethnic racial socialization. So the ways that African American parents talk to their youth about race and racism. And one of the things that I found was that when the parents or the youth believed that their parents were talking to them or uplifting the Black race and exposing them to cultural artifacts, they had lower levels of racial stress. They had more advanced racial identity development. They were better able to think and really critically analyze things around race and racism. So I think it just goes to show that, if we're already confident and grounded and firm of our understanding of who we are, it's just more difficult to be thrown off. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Illuminating our brilliance in this moment. Yeah. And, so one of the things that was just brought up for me as you were speaking, Dana, was, that in addition to what we know the struggles, we know the pieces that that we've come from in regards to the negative legacies, but what we need to celebrate and continue to remind ourselves is the ways in which, you know, as a people, we have this power that exists. And that might be part in cultivating that and utilizing that and thinking back on the richness of that. That could be part of the liberatory experience moving forward. It could be what we need moving forward. And so I guess I would wonder, again, putting it out to everybody, what are the ways in which we do that? How do we celebrate that? How do we illuminate that, as Jamila just mentioned in the comment?
Dana, what you were saying, when you mentioned that, it was reminding me of Dr. Joy DeGrew's work on positive racial socialization and how impactful that is, you know, around sort of countering the narrative. And I don't know if I can be indulgent and share a 2-minute clip from Toni Morrison again, which kind of speaks to some of what we're talking about here. And again, if nothing else, certainly inspiration, I think, around the idea. But I don't know if I can I send it, can I give the clip to, like, do I have share screen power? Oh, okay, I do. Okay, I do, yeah. Here we go.
It's a
Can you see it? Can you see that? Okay, hold on.
But let me tell you, that's the wrong question.
Okay, what's the right question?
How do you feel? Not you, Charlie Rose,
right.
But don't you understand that the people who do this thing, who practice racism,
right.
are bereft? There is something distorted about the psyche. It's a huge waste, and it's a corruption and a distortion. It's a profound neurosis that nobody examines for what it is. It feels crazy. It is crazy. And it has just as much of a deleterious effect on white people, and possibly equal, as it does black people. I always knew that I had the moral high ground all my life. I always thought those people who said I couldn't come in the drugstore and I had to sit in these funny places, I couldn't go in the park.
You felt morally superior to them from day one.
And I thought they knew that I knew that they were inferior to me morally. I always thought that. And my parents always thought that.
You said your father was racist because he always felt like he was superior.
That's right. He always felt superior. And that was a form, you know, of defensive racism. But if the racist white person, I don't mean the person who is examining his consciousness and so on, doesn't understand that he or she is also a race, it's also constructed, it's also made, and it also has some kind of serviceability. But when you take it away, I take your race away, and there you are, all strung out, and all you got is your little self. And what is that? What are you without racism? Are you any good? Are you still strong? You still smart? You still like yourself? I mean, these are the questions. Part of it is, yes, the victim, how terrible it has been for black people.
But you don't like that.
I'm not a victim. I refuse to be one.
And the victim is the other person who is morally inferior and
that's a
has
serious
to hold
question.
on to
of course.
Racism
if you have
somehow
to hold, that's
for
right.
his or her own self-esteem and definition.
If you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And my feeling is white people have a very, very serious problem. And they
I think that's the end. Is that the end of it? Did you get that? Okay. And I just wanted to share that because she's so powerful in terms of like her sense of confidence, which we already know, but that like that to what Dana was talking about in terms of ancestral, you know, sort of wisdom and almost the moral high ground and the spiritual high ground, that is something that perhaps, you know, can be carried forward. And then whatever, you know, wants to be done, whether it's poetry or dance or, you know, cooking or anything in terms of, you know, joy and nourishment, you know, on top of that. But I just loved her piece there where she was saying that, you know, I just feel, you know, I feel better about myself. There is no human master.
Hello, this is Janice Williams.
Yes.
First of all, I just want to thank you for this forum. It's so necessary and appreciated. There are so many things to talk about, to address. And when this forum was opened up with the terms that are being used, white fragility and emotional equity, and on, microaggression. We need those terms because it helps us to know what we're talking about and can communicate with one another. I am not ready to teach, not ready to teach anyone anything. I might be ready later, but right now I'm not. I'm very much aware of my fatigue, I think, as Jamila, I think it was you who said that. I used the word exhausted. I'm exhausted. And I'm exhausted when I think of our history and how we have been well raised. It's been a movie that's been repeated over and over, that we are here to serve. I know that I'll come to some kind of equilibrium about all this, but I know how I feel right now. And when I hear Toni Morrison, I just want to say, thank God you have a voice and you're saying this stuff is crazy. I think it, you know, I believe someone mentioned, you know, where do we go and what can we do? And I can only speak for myself. And in a way, I just, you know, want to maybe speak for others in a way who are not here. That we come from so many different experiences. It's like a family, and you have you have 10 heads of kids or 10 head of kids, whatever they say, and each child is different. You know, we are all different, and our experiences in this Black life can be different to a greater or lesser degree. But there's a common core, and the common core is that we have been invisible, and now we're trying to help ourselves rise up. And many of us have been fighting the fight. So I think, you know, for me, it's a process. I applaud those, certainly I applaud those who walk with us. Those who don't, I don't want to convince. Those who are fragile, um, um, I don't want to soothe them. It's energy that I need to spread the word, to support all of us in this struggle. So again, I just want to thank you for this wonderful forum. It's helping me not only deal with white supremacy, privilege, power, but also know my own fragility when I try to get in touch with how I am feeling. So this is helpful and a step for me along that process. I don't know if I lost audio.
Thank you. I think I had cut out. I'm sorry, so I might have missed most of that. I apologize. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I was able to hear what you said, and just acknowledging and taking that in and saying thank you, and essentially protecting your energy. Not here to educate others, here to protect my energy. If someone else wants to do that, go ahead. But for me, not so much right now.
I'm just taking a look at the chat and seeing that we have some input. So Joselita asks, Joselita Mercado, what advice would you give to BIPOC now in a diversity and inclusion position in a majority white workplace? So taking some of what we're talking about and making it, I guess, applying it or making it more concrete is the question. I don't know if others have thoughts about that, but I think that's something that people, I know that many of us have to face, and we're wondering how people do face that.
You know, I'll jump in. I'm awake now. Let me contextualize the answer by giving you a metaphor of how I think about the ways in which diversity and inclusion has been conceptualized in a more contemporary way. I apologize for those who've heard the story too many times, but here it is. I liken it to inviting people over to your house for dinner. There's two different ways to do this. I can invite folks from different walks of life and make all of my favorite foods, so I know I'm giving them the best of me. And when they come, they're going to get, yes, fried chicken. They're going to get some collard greens, and there will be a little bit of pork in it, not much. All these things. And yet my guests sit down, and now they're struggling because several of them are vegans, several are vegetarians. That's one way of doing diversity and inclusion, that I have got a rainbow around the table, but you're all eating my food. Another way of doing it is to say, let me figure out, what are your dietary needs as I invite you to my house, so that when I cook, I make sure there's something here for you. I'm still going to eat my fried chicken and my collard greens, but there's something here for you. So I've changed. There's something different at my table that's probably there for the very first time, because I want you to be comfortable when you're here. And now I've learned a new food. So I hope you can get what I'm saying. That diversity and inclusion has been misinterpreted again in a Western way of thinking, of either or, linear thinking, of being, how many multiple different hues can I have and differentness can I count? But yet I haven't changed how I teach, work, or anything else. So I'm now inviting everyone to digest my reality. And also, the question is very problematic in itself, in the sense that when you look at higher ed, and if someone did the stats on this one, whoever's teaching a multicultural course is probably someone who identifies as anything but white in general. Okay, there's going to be a few changes, a few variants. Anyone who is running the diversity and inclusion officer, again, is most likely someone who's not white. So again, what is this saying? What is it saying about the psyche of of the United States around its capacity to really engage in these genuine conversations? Because we are, as Kirk Snyder, who's a colleague of mine with Division 32 would say, it's a polarized mind, that somehow we've already reduced everything about color and differences must be done by someone from a targeted group, and then everything else is taught by everybody else. So I don't have an answer for the young lady. I just, other than to say, one of the questions on my licensing exam that I remember from, which was almost 30 years ago, the correct answer was misery loves miserable company. There's a validation that you're alone in this awkward position of having to say to the power of a predominantly white institution, my assumption based on the question, that you're putting me in the wrong position as a person who doesn't identify as white to try to help this powerful institution do its own business around diversity and inclusion.
Yes, you spoke to my heart. Thank you so much for the analogy. That really made a vision for me. And I appreciate your wisdom on this. It's definitely been difficult adjusting. I'm willing to do the work, but there is a lot of challenges, as everyone knows, on this call. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you so much.
And yet, how beautiful would it be if someone else was doing the work as a model for those who do need to do the work?
Yes. Yes, my question exactly.
Because I'll also add too, most times, and I'm pretty sure the literature supports this too, particularly coming out of Division 45 of APA, which also shows that not only are the majority of the people who teach the multicultural course people of color, they're also the ones who are most likely to get complaints. Because there's a certain, which again, in my mind, is playing out the scenario once again, where you're more likely to give derogatory comments to a professor of color than anyone else. And when that professor of color is also the one doing the multicultural course, and it's the only time that you're really having to embrace and deal with issues around multicultural, because you've studied everything else in your program and it never came up. You studied everything else in your program and no one ever asked you to think about your own space around these issues, then it's a setup. It's an emotional setup for everyone.
Oh my God, thank you so much for speaking to that, because it really is. I didn't have the words to put to it, but emotional setup is a great phrase to use. Yeah, I feel like that's the thing that they don't realize, is that with all this, where it seems very, difficult to change their perspective after so many, years or their existence, not like thinking about this, it's like, well, we're also waking up to, the truth of history, and recognizing all the different ways that we are oppressed, that we have just accepted as our, reality in most cases. So, yeah, emotional. I love that phrase. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question and for, definitely leading us in that, Dr. Jackson. That was extremely important, especially in thinking about, again, all the ways in which we are oppressed. We, find the multiple levels in which this is manifest in work settings, especially when you think about D&I efforts in different systems. I guess it's also, you know, leads us to thinking about, again, what this, you know, our efforts and the ways in which we can have liberatory experiences. Maybe, Princess, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, some of the experiential ways in which that happens.
Thanks, Tanya. Just to make sure I'm understanding what you're throwing to me, the experiential ways in which liberatory experiences happen, meaning how can we actually take up the space and be more alive and free and yeah, okay. I'm just making sure. You know, I mean, yeah, because we've been, you know, this is a heavy conversation, right? Like this is just like the whole thing, and so even just like noticing and like taking a pause and just breathing, like Dana started with, right? Just like taking a moment, say, I'm here and I'm breathing and I'm alive and I'm on the, you know, shoulders of everyone who's come before me, and just sort of checking in and just saying, wow, you know, like this is my life and here we are. And there's all of these structures around me that make me feel like I can get closed in and boxed in, but that also, like right now in this moment, I'm the awareness of like our ability to kind of just even be here together, as Dr. Jackson said, family, you know, is so amazing, and so nourishing. So the noticing of that can actually help take that in more. That's sort of the positive sort of neuroplasticity piece, the subcortical piece around like, you know, sort of turning our attention to all this, you know, craziness, as you know, Toni Morrison was saying, is continuing over here. And I'm just noticing how, you know, nourishing and beautiful it is to actually be here and feel it. Like take a moment and really let it in and receive it. Because a lot of what we've been talking about is very important and critical and sometimes can go in the left brain. But what is it really like to just actually have that dinner table and have everything on it? And have us just kick back the way that we want to. Eating that fried chicken, those collard greens. Really maybe taking in a moment of what is that backyard barbecue cookout that we love, that we remember, that we know. Just maybe in an imaginal way, calling up that juicy memory last summer or from childhood or, you know, at your grandma's house or anybody that, you know, you had a good experiences with. The music, what song was playing, who was dancing, what were the smells, what was someone wearing that you remember their yellow dress. Really taking that in for you, just finding that experience, locating that. There's something that's good in my life that my body knows how to take in that's good. My body still knows how to do this. Tasting the food, the texture, the crunch of the fried chicken, the tang of the one piece of pork that's in there. Just noticing. Ah, yeah, I got it. When you get the baby with the king cake, woo, surprise. And just, again, sort of really just allowing that to drop. And what is it like when you hear that piece of music, that jazz playing, and they're just riffing and that improv is just going? And there's no one watching, there's no one there, just being in the moment. To not feel hunted, as one of my clients says, to not feel like I'm always having to be witness, but to just be, to just enjoy my authentic presence, my breath. And just maybe taking a moment to just think about what are the ways in which you feel the most connected. Is it basketball? Is it cooking? Is it dancing? You know, where is my sense of things? Last night, I found myself writing a poem. And I wrote, you know, for a little while. And that was a way of nourishing me and reclaiming that space for me. What's your way? So if we're not going to try to fix or do, as one of the previous speakers, you know, saying, I'm not trying to educate you over here. How am I reclaiming my space? Generating my creativity. Enjoying the connections I feel and know that are real and authentic to me. I'm not making them up. How am I highlighting them? How am I remembering that this is what's good that's here? And allowing my body and mind to have a recognition and a gratitude for that in real time, even if it's going back to a memory that we have and that's held in our body. And that's a practice or an exercise we can do anytime. And I don't know if anyone has any thoughts or feelings about that, but you know, I know that sometimes, you know, with resourcing and in working with different ways, we can forget and feel so closed in that we actually have had moments. Maybe they're not constant, but we have had these moments where we do feel okay. Most often, we've been fortunate enough to at least have that at some point. And that it's our job, or that it's one of the things we can do to bring that in. Right now, it's really difficult. This part of me feels like I'm being cornered. And I also have this space where I feel free on the dance floor. I feel free in my kitchen, in my backyard, with my friends, with my whatever. So just a reminder that we can do that. I guess that's all I really wanted to say there about that. I don't know if that makes sense, or if anyone has anything that they want to share from maybe their own lived experience of what they love. When do you feel most free? I put this to the group. Is it a dance? Is it a cooking? Is it a writing? When are you most free, most creative, most connected, most grounded, most your authentic self? On the dance floor, Dr. Jackson vibing, yes. What are the tunes? Do we have any particular ones? That's right. Soul, yes, yes. Denise Hines Zami, raised hand. And someone. R&B, yeah. Painting, beautiful.
And Denise, if you want to unmute yourself, you can feel free to do so.
Around children, there's always a restoration of hope there, Jamila says, Dr. Codrington. And Joselita says, singing, beautiful. Yeah, Denise, I don't know if you're unmuted.
She is. I'm trying to unmute her, but it's not letting me. I'm not sure what that's about. Let's see. So Dr. Heinzami, if you look next to your name on the right, there should be a microphone with a red line crossed out. If you just click on that, I think that should unmute, and we'll be able to hear you. Because I'm not sure why I'm not able. I should be able to unmute. Zoom.
One of the things that brought up for me, Francesca, is so during this time of COVID, one of the things that I set up was just gathering, especially in my workspace, which in many ways has felt additionally oppressive. Oh, great. So I'll come back to that. I just want to have Dr. Hines be able to speak.
Thank you. My son was able to help me.
Okay.
I feel most free when I'm able to do whatever I want, whenever I want, and however I want. I feel most free if I'm walking down the street and I feel like smiling or speaking to someone. I don't feel inhibited to do so or have to second guess whatever they're going to be thinking because I did it. I feel most free when I can think of something and it manifests in my life. Even if it's not at that moment, a little later. That's when I feel most free.
Mm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah, that's great.
Now, how do I unmute?
Yeah. Yeah. And I just love what you were just saying, like just walking down the street and smiling, you know, like if, you know, that freedom is, you know, in some ways within, you know, my mindfulness teacher, Dr. Jack Kornfield, talks about Nelson Mandela. He tells the story a lot about, you know, being on Robben Island for 27 years, but internally having that sense of dignity, you know, and that nobility and that sort of sense of internal freedom at a certain level. That's critical. And just noting the chat, being out in nature is one of the comments. Kim Murby says block party or family gatherings. Again, like we can receive nourishment from others who we feel safe with. Jogging and being mindful of nature, Rod says, that's beautiful. And like I said, Dr. Codrington, around kids. Yeah.
And you know, that gathering with people is part of what I was going to say. Is at work I've started to gather BIPOC people in this like group. So we have this like group meeting that we do, and that's been really nourishing. It's that connectedness, and making those connections has been very nourishing in a lot of ways. Having the laughs, sharing different music that we enjoy, a lot of Bob Marley that we've been engaging in. So for some of our Caribbean BIPOC that we've been gathering. So it's just important to have that connection. I think that's what that brought up for me.
Beautiful. And cooking and making music. Yeah. Yeah, connection, cooking, making music. I mean, we are relational. And so are we relational to ourselves in those moments that we need our own self-care and self-nourishment? You all are familiar with, I'm sure, the NAP ministry, you know, that rest is restoration. And if you're not, I think it's really a great, you know, thing to follow, the NAP ministry, like NAP. You know, whatever your creativity is, the painting, the cooking, the making music even. Anyone else want to share? Call in user 1. I don't know. I guess to Dr. Codrington's point from earlier, what we turn our attention to grows in that way. And so when we have those moments where we're not under direct threat, even if we're in some ways in a constrained environment like work, if we can find a place where we can turn our attention to something that is beautiful and connective, like Dr. White Davis was saying, or even if you can bring in like your altar, your plant, your photo, whatever it is, create that space for yourself, a sacred space. Or perhaps one of the things that in my Indigenous training, it was, you know, sort of emphasized is that, you know, have rituals that you embed for yourself within your day. Whether it's that you have a scarf over your lap and that after your, you know, sessions with clients, if you're doing clinical work, that you sort of shake it off and you give it back to the land, or you give it back to the air, or you give it back to the water. Again, imaginally, you're giving it back to the earth that can hold, or to the sky, or to the air that can hold, and that it's not always just in us. We're reminding ourselves we're connected to something much greater, including one another. And that we're here, and that implicit moving forward is always wanting to come forward. That survivorship, that comradeship, that collective, that there's always something in us in that spirit. Yeah, rituals. Listening to burning spears. I don't know that one, but okay. I'm just reading the comments. Must be a band or a album. Anyone else want to share? I guess, go back to things like risk and protective factors and social determinants of health. These are our own way of generating those for ourselves today. This is our way of doing that as a buffer. This is our way of really having an opportunity to remind ourselves that we are entitled to take this for ourselves. We may not always be given it in the spaces that we're in easily on a silver platter, the way that structurally, if there were the changes that should have happened and should be in place now, would be more accessible. But really just having this opportunity to remind ourselves, I'm taking this, I'm saying no, I'm putting it on pause, I'm, going to, I am going to sit with my other BIPOC friends. I am not going to have, lunch with another, whatever. Like I'm entitled to have that agency and that choice, and allowing our organism to remember that we have that agency. That it's okay to have a limit, and how that's different from just being walled off or withdrawing. I can still be engaged and present, but I can also choose health for myself, putting on my own oxygen mask first, so to speak. That's important. And in COVID, it's a little weird. We don't have quite exactly the same opportunities maybe for some of the movement that we did, and yet, what was it, a month ago, Dana, or two, we did the Zoom dance party. I know Dr. Codrington was there. She's smiling. And to Dr. Jackson's point, I had on, the cameo, or I don't know what I was playing at that point. But it was good to do some chair dancing on Zoom, if for nothing else. And things like that are important. I mean, they make me feel alive, in this time of feeling a little constrained. Know your worth, noble and dignified, relaxed and alert, and here I am.
There's something about those Zoom dance parties that are just so freeing. It's nice to get a different posture, and
Yeah. I missed that. Repeat. What I said, noble and dignified, relaxed and alert. Yeah, I think that's what you mean. I think, meaning that, like, it's this relationship to always remind ourselves that, I'm worthy, I'm here. There's this chaos happening here, and that's fine. And there are people who are making noise about things and doing all kinds of structural pieces, but let's have, okay, she wants a job. Yes, we'll do the Zoom dance party. Okay, I will do another Zoom dance party. Okay. I'm happy to do that. And you know what, I'm just gonna, because we have 7 minutes left, I'll mention this now. All right, Dr. Jackson, I'm with you on that. I even have strobe lights and things, try to make it fun. On Wednesday, I'll be doing a show. I do an online web TV show with my friend, Brian Wesley Johnson, whose parents, are therapists. He's not, but he helps me produce this show called Inside Out with Dr. Natasha Stovall, who's a white psychologist who wrote an article called Whiteness on the Couch. And she and I have been partnering to try and do some work. And on Wednesday, Dana is going to be a guest along with Lynn Min, who's a therapist in New York also, to talk about creativity and joy as a portal to you know, healing and liberation. And so it's at noontime Eastern time on Wednesday on Solivity, and it's also on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. And then it's aired, recorded, and you know, you can watch it on a replay or whatever it is on YouTube. But the conversation really was about, well, Dana, do you want to even mention it, where we came to about?
Thank you. And I am really looking forward to that. I hope that others will be able to tune in. Part of what I'm going to be talking about is the importance of culturally grounded practices, and particularly understanding what they are and where they come from, because I think that a lot of us enjoy our cultural practices, dancing, movement, rhythm, but we don't always understand where they come from. And I think if we understand where they come from, we can really better tap into their healing properties. So that's one perspective I'll be bringing. Thank you.
Right, beautiful, thank you. Where are they coming from? And also, you know, the other therapist will be on was talking a little bit about, you know, this isn't American Idol. This isn't performative, you know, art. This is like the real deal. This is coming out of struggle. This is coming out of something, but it makes it that much more rich and that much more deep and that much more joyful. So, you know, if you want to tune in, and if not, you can watch the replay if you want, but great.
And I guess I just want to, you know, I know we have a couple minutes left, so I just want to also, you know, thank you for kind of bringing us in this moment of thinking about how we engage in things, and you know, think about when we are our authentic selves, when we think about when we have joy, when that's brought into our life, and in moments of liberation. So hopefully as we move at least through this week, if not through the rest of our time, how do we connect more to that as individuals and collectives? So just inviting everyone to think about that for themselves and continue to do that, engage in those ways, those practices, those rituals that keep you grounded, keep you connected, and keep you moving towards that liberation. Are there any last thoughts before we leave? All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here, for joining us in the space, and for your thoughts. And thank you for being you. And we hope you take care.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be well and take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
So glad you're all here with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Enjoy your painting and your dancing and your cooking and your jogging and your, enjoy those things. Enjoy. Really just soak it in. Thank you.
Bye.
Great job, Francesca.
Oh, thank you.